The first drops of rain fell like accusations against Penelope Ashworth's upturned face, each one a cold reminder that even the weather conspired against her on this wretched afternoon in late June. And she stood perfectly still, beneath the inadequate shelter of the abandoned bandstand in Hyde Park, her muslin gown already soaked through to her chemise, watching Lord Marcus Cleverley's carriage disappear into the grey curtain of the storm without so much as a backward glance from the man who had mere moments ago been discussing their potential future, together with all the enthusiasm of someone selecting cuts of meat at the butcher. 6 months, she thought, her fingers tightening around the bouquet of roses he had brought her, their petals already drooping in the sudden deluge. 6 months of enduring his condescending lectures about how a woman must comport herself. 6 months of pretending not to notice when his eyes wandered to younger, prettier, wealthier girls at every social gathering. 6 months of her mother's hopeful questions each morning about whether Lord Cleverley had finally made his intentions clear, and this was how it ended, with him muttering something about an urgent matter requiring his immediate attention and climbing into his dry, comfortable carriage while she stood there like a fool, already drenched, already the object of whispers and pointed fingers from the fashionable crowd that had been promenading through the park only minutes before the storm broke. The sky had turned the color of bruised plums with shocking swiftness, the kind of summer tempest that arrived without warning and sent the ton scattering to their equipages like insects fleeing light. And Penelope watched them go, with the detached observation of someone cataloguing her own humiliation for future reference, noting Lady Pemberton's poorly concealed smirk as her footman handed her into her barouche, marking the way Mrs. Hartwell whispered behind her fan to her daughter while looking directly at Penelope, storing away the sound of masculine laughter from a group of young bucks who found something amusing in the sight of Miss Ashworth standing alone in the rain. She would not cry. That much she knew with absolute certainty, because tears were a luxury she could no longer afford, not after 5 years of holding together what remained of her family's dignity, with nothing but stubborn pride and careful economies, not after watching her father drink and gamble away their fortune and good name before dying and leaving her with an invalid mother and a crumbling townhouse in an unfashionable part of London, not after clawing her way back to the fringes of respectability through sheer force of will, only to have Marcus Cleverley use her as a placeholder while he angled for someone better. The rain intensified, turning from scattered drops to a proper downpour, and she heard the crack of thunder roll across the park, saw the serpentine lake whipped into choppy little waves, by the wind watched the willow trees bend and sway like dancers performing some frantic ballet, noted how the few remaining parasols in the park turned inside out and had to be abandoned by their holders, observed the steam rising from the sun-warmed pathways as the cold rain struck them. And through it all, she remained motionless, because movement would require a decision, and she was not yet ready to face the practical realities of her situation. 3 miles to walk home in a soaking wet dress, she calculated with the ruthless practicality that had kept her family fed these past years. The only good walking dress she owned ruined beyond repair, her kid leather half-boots certainly destroyed by the water already pooling around her feet, and worst of all the explanation she would have to offer her mother, dear, hopeful mamma, who believed Lord Cleverley was their salvation, who had already begun planning the modest wedding breakfast they could afford, who would be waiting by the window watching for Penelope's return with good news. "Poor Miss Ashworth," she heard someone say from beneath the shelter of a nearby oak. "First her father's scandal, and now this. She'll never recover her reputation." And another voice responded with vicious satisfaction that Cleverley was always too good for her anyway, that he had been seen just yesterday driving in the park with the Wilmington heiress, a girl fresh from the schoolroom with £40,000 and connections to half the peerage. The words should have stung, but Penelope found herself oddly numb to them, as if the cold rain had frozen not just her skin, but her capacity for further hurt. And she looked down at the bedraggled roses in her hand, and thought how fitting it was that these flowers, purchased by a man who cared nothing for her, were dying in her grasp just as her last hope for a respectable future died in the rain-soaked reality of her abandonment. Across the Serpentine, though she did not yet know it, Alexander Hartley, the Duke of Ashford, sat astride his massive black stallion and watched the scene unfold with a fury that surprised him in its intensity, his gloved hands tightening on the reins until his horse, sensing his agitation, stamped and tossed its great head in confusion at its master's unusual tension. He had ridden to the park seeking solitude, escaping yet another of his aunt's interminable dinner parties, where every unmarried woman of the ton was paraded before him like prize livestock, and he had found his usual spot near the water where he could observe humanity from a safe distance without being obliged to participate in its endless social machinations. But now he found himself unable to look away from the solitary figure standing in the bandstand while the storm raged around her. He knew who she was, of course he knew, because Alexander Hartley made it his business to know everything about everyone who moved through London society, particularly those who suffered under its cruelties, and he had watched Miss Penelope Ashworth with reluctant admiration for months now as she navigated the shark-infested waters of the marriage mart with her chin high and her circumstances carefully concealed behind a facade of gentle breeding. He had seen her at the theatre once, in the cheapest box, wearing a gown that had been turned and remade so skillfully that only someone looking closely would notice, sitting beside a thin woman who must be her invalid mother. And he had noticed how Penelope's face lit with genuine joy during the performance, even as she carefully avoided the eyes of those in the better boxes who had once called her family friends before her father's fall from grace. He had observed her at Almack's on one of the rare occasions she could afford the subscription, watching her dance with second sons and fortune hunters, always gracious, always composed, never allowing the desperation of her situation to show in her demeanor. And he had felt something uncomfortably close to respect for this woman who refused to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed someone with less steel in her spine. And now that damned fool cleverly had abandoned her in a storm, left her standing alone to face the vicious gossip of people who would tear her to shreds for this public humiliation, and Alexander felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached as he watched her standing there, refusing to run, refusing to cry, maintaining her dignity even as the world quite literally rained down upon her. "Damn fool doesn't deserve her," he muttered to his horse, his voice rough with an emotion he did not care to examine too closely. None of them do, and the stallion's ears flicked back as if in agreement with this assessment of Lord Cleverley's character. The rational part of Alexander's mind, the part that had kept him alive through military campaigns and political battles, told him this was not his concern, that Miss Ashworth's difficulties were her own affair, that he had deliberately isolated himself from society's dramas for good reason after losing his sister Catherine to a marriage that had killed her as surely as a bullet, that he owed this woman nothing, and intervention would only complicate his carefully maintained distance from emotional entanglement. But there was another part of him, buried deep beneath years of cultivated coldness and deliberate isolation, that remembered what it felt like to arrive too late, to find someone you should have protected, already lost beyond saving, and that part of him was already calculating the distance across the park, already knowing that he could not, would not, stand by and watch while another woman was destroyed by society's casual cruelties and the selfishness of men who saw women as nothing more than conveniences to be used and discarded at will. The last of the fashionable crowd had fled now, leaving only Penelope and a few hardy souls dashing through the rain toward shelter, and Alexander watched as she finally moved, taking one step forward as if preparing to begin the long walk home, her shoulders squared beneath her sodden gown, her head held high despite everything, and in that moment he made his decision with the same decisive clarity that had once made him an excellent military commander. He would intervene, propriety be damned, because he had failed his sister, but he would not fail this stranger who stood alone in the storm with such heartbreaking dignity. And with a touch of his heels he sent his stallion plunging forward through the rain, thunder rolling overhead as if nature itself acknowledged the significance of what was about to unfold. Penelope had taken perhaps 3 steps away from the bandstand, her sodden skirts heavy as chainmail around her legs and her teeth beginning to chatter from the cold that had seeped into her very bones, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at a speed that seemed reckless given the slick pathways and driving rain, and she turned just in time to see a massive black stallion bearing down upon her with a rider whose dark greatcoat billowed behind him like the wings of some avenging angel. The few remaining Gawkers who had lingered to witness her humiliation scattered as the Duke of Ashford brought his mount to a halt mere feet from where she stood, and before Penelope could form a coherent thought, much less a protest, he had dismounted in one fluid motion and was striding toward her with the kind of purposeful intent that brooked no argument or delay. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words emerged because he was already removing his greatcoat, the fine wool still warm from his body, and draping it around her shoulders with an efficiency that spoke of military training, or perhaps simply of a man accustomed to making decisions and expecting them to be obeyed without question. "Your Grace?" she managed to stammer. "This is most improper. We have not even been properly introduced." But her words were lost as he bent and lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child, his arms beneath her knees and back, and she found herself pressed against a chest that was solid as oak and surprisingly warm despite the rain that had soaked through his coat and waistcoat to the shirt beneath. "What's improper?" he said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made her breath catch. "Is leaving a woman defenseless in a storm?" And then he was placing her atop his stallion with the same decisive efficiency he had shown in everything else, and she clutched at the horse's mane with numb fingers as he swung up behind her in one powerful motion that made the animal sidestep and toss its head. "Hold tight, Miss Ashworth," he said, his arms coming around her to grasp the reins, effectively creating a cage of warmth and strength and masculine presence that her body responded to even as her mind struggled to process what was happening. "We're riding to Gretna. Green." The words made no sense, or rather they made a terrible kind of sense that her cold, shocked brain refused to accept, and she tried to turn her head to look at him, but found herself pressed too firmly against his chest to manage more than a slight twist that brought her cheek into contact with the wet linen of his shirt. Surely she had misheard. Surely the Duke of Ashford, the Iron Duke himself, the man who had rejected every marriage-minded mamma and eligible daughter in London for the past decade, could not possibly have just announced his intention to carry her off to Scotland for an irregular marriage, and yet his arms tightened fractionally as he spurred the horse forward, and she felt the powerful muscles of the stallion bunch beneath them as they began moving through the rain at a pace that sent spray flying up from the puddled pathways. "Your reputation is now destroyed," he said, his voice clipped and precise, despite the thunder that rolled overhead, and the pounding of hooves beneath them, abandoned publicly by your suitor, witnessed by half of fashionable London. Within hours you'll be blamed rather than pitied. They'll say you drove him away with your desperation or your demands or simply your unsuitability. You know how they operate, Miss Ashworth. You've seen how quickly they turn on their own. She did know. God help her. She knew exactly how vicious the ton could be to a woman who fell from grace, had experienced it herself after her father's scandal when invitations dried up and former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her, had watched her mother's health deteriorate under the strain of social exile and financial ruin, and some terrible practical part of her brain was already confirming what the Duke had stated so baldly. "You have 2 choices," he continued, and she felt his breath warm against her wet hair, a sensation so intimate it made something low in her stomach tighten in a way she had never experienced before. "Return home to face ruin or marry me tonight, and face me instead." The absurdity of it struck her then, the sheer impossibility of what he was suggesting, and she found her voice at last, though it came out shaking and thin. "You cannot be serious, Your Grace. We have never even been introduced. This is madness. You cannot simply kidnap a woman and announce your intention to marry her as though discussing the weather." "I know everything necessary," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made her realize he was entirely serious. "You're Penelope Ashworth, daughter of the late Viscount Ashworth, who lost his fortune and good name at cards. You've spent 5 years caring for your invalid mother while fending off fortune hunters who want your family's remaining estate. You're 26 and considered firmly on the shelf, and that fool Cleverly was your last desperate attempt at a respectable match. Am I incorrect in any particular?" The casual recitation of her life's miseries, delivered in that cool, precise tone as they galloped through the rain, should have angered her, but instead she felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes spread through her chest. "You've had me investigated," she whispered, and it was not a question, but a statement of terrible comprehension. "You've been watching me." "I make it my business," he said, and now they were leaving the park proper and turning onto the streets where a few hardy souls still hurried through the storm, but none paid attention to a man on horseback, with what appeared to be his wife or sister held before him. To know who suffers from society's cruelty, I watched Cleverly court you with one eye always on richer prospects, watched you endure his condescension with grace, watched him abandon you. I won't watch you be destroyed by it." "So this is pity?" she said, and felt her spine stiffen despite the cold and shock and the strange warmth spreading through her body where it pressed against his. "You're rescuing me out of pity." His arms tightened around her, not painfully but with unmistakable emphasis, and his voice when he spoke had gone hard as steel. "This is justice," he said, "and perhaps self-preservation. I'm 34 years old and weary of fighting off matchmaking mamas. You need protection and status. I need a wife who won't bore me to madness with vapid conversation. We are both practical people, Miss Ashworth. This is a practical solution." She should protest, should demand he take her home, should scream for help from the passers-by they were now moving past at a canter that ate up the London streets with shocking speed. But her body had other ideas entirely, because for the first time in what felt like years, she had stopped shivering, the combination of his greatcoat and his body heat driving away the bone-deep cold that had settled into her during those endless minutes, standing alone in the rain. Some part of her recognized that she should be terrified, that this was precisely the sort of scandalous situation young ladies were warned against, that accepting this mad proposal would tie her forever to a man she did not know, and who clearly did not love her. But another part, the practical, ruthless part that had kept her family from starvation these past years, was rapidly calculating the benefits of such an arrangement. As the Duchess of Ashford, she would have the resources to provide her mother with proper medical care, would never again have to choose between coal for the fire and medicines, would be protected from fortune hunters and the endless humiliations of trying to maintain genteel poverty's facade. And yes, she would be married to a stranger. But was that truly worse than being married to Marcus Cleverly, who had proven himself willing to abandon her without a second thought? They were passing through streets she recognized now, moving north and east, and her heart gave a painful lurch as she realized they would pass near her own modest townhouse, would ride right past the home where her mother sat waiting by the window for news of Lord Cleverly's proposal, and she opened her mouth to beg him to stop, to let her at least send word that she was safe. But then she saw the corner of her street approaching, and the Duke made no move to slow the horse. She could see the familiar iron railing, the chipped paint on the door that they could not afford to have repainted, the window of the drawing-room where Mamma would be sitting with her shawl and her hope, and Penelope felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since this entire nightmare began, because her mother would be so worried, would wait, and eventually send their single remaining servant out to inquire, would imagine all manner of terrible fates befalling her only daughter. please," she whispered. "My mother, I must send word to my mother." But the Duke's response was to lean forward slightly, bringing his lips close to her ear. "I will send word within the hour that you are safe and under my protection," he said, and she felt the vibration of his words through her back, where it pressed against his chest. "I will send my own physician to attend her and servants to ensure her comfort. She will want for nothing, you have my word. But we cannot stop now, because every moment we delay increases the risk that someone will recognize us and attempt to intervene." The practicality of it, the clear evidence that he had thought through even these details, should have reassured her, but instead it made her realize just how thoroughly he had planned this intervention. How long he must have been watching and waiting for an opportunity to act, and she did not know whether to be grateful or terrified by the implications. They had left the familiar streets of London proper now, and were heading into the outer reaches where buildings grew farther apart, and the road stretched north toward the highway that would eventually lead to Scotland, and the rain showed no signs of lessening. If anything, it had intensified into a proper deluge that turned the world into shades of grey and made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. She became aware of small details with the heightened perception that came from shock. The way his arms flexed as he guided the horse around a particularly deep puddle, the steady rhythm of his breathing that suggested he was not at all affected by the physical exertion of controlling a powerful stallion at speed through a storm, the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his greatcoat and seemed to envelop her in its masculine warmth, and most disturbingly, the way her body had molded itself to his without conscious thought, seeking his heat and solidity with an instinct that bypassed all rational consideration. She had never been this close to a man who was not her father, had certainly never been pressed against a masculine body with only the thin barrier of wet fabric between them, and she found herself noticeably aware of the hard planes of his chest, the strength in the arms that encircled her, the power of the thighs that gripped the horse on either side of her own legs, and something hot and unfamiliar uncurled in her belly at these observations. He must have felt her slight shift, because his arms tightened fractionally, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its cold precision and taken on a quality she could not quite identify. "You're shaking," he said. "Are you cold or afraid?" And she realized, with a start, that she was indeed trembling, but not from cold, because his body heat had driven away the chill, which meant she must be shaking from fear or shock, or possibly the sheer overwhelming surreality of finding herself being carried off to Gretna Green by a duke she had never spoken to before this moment. "Both," she managed to say, and felt rather than saw his nod of acknowledgement. "That's honest, at least," he replied. "I can work with honest. What I cannot abide is vapid simpering or false sentiment. You strike me as someone who deals in truth, Miss Ashworth, so let me give you truth in return. This marriage will be one of convenience and mutual benefit. I will provide for you and your mother, protect you from society's viciousness, give you the status and security you need. In return, you will be my duchess, manage my households, appear at my side at necessary social functions, and otherwise live your life as you see fit, provided you maintain discretion and propriety." The clinical nature of his proposed arrangement should have reassured her, should have made this seem like nothing more than a business transaction. But instead, she found herself oddly hurt by his casual dismissal of any possibility of affection or companionship, as though he were hiring a housekeeper rather than taking a wife. "And what of children?" she heard herself ask. "What of heirs? Surely a duke requires heirs," and felt her face flame at her own boldness in raising such an indelicate subject. There was a long pause, during which the only sounds were the pounding hooves, the driving rain, and the thunder that continued to roll across the darkening sky. And then he said quietly, "That will be discussed between us after the marriage. I will not demand what you are unwilling to give, but yes, eventually I will need an heir." The implication hung between them, heavy with unspoken meanings. the acknowledgement that this practical arrangement would at some point require the most intimate of acts, and Penelope felt her breath catch at the thought of this stranger, this cold, precise duke, touching her in ways she had only vaguely imagined in the privacy of her own thoughts. They had left London entirely behind now and were galloping along the North Road as daylight faded into the peculiar grey twilight that came during storms, and she realized with a clarity that cut through her shock that this was the point of no return. That once they crossed into the countryside proper, there would be no going back, no changing her mind, no returning to her old life of genteel poverty and diminishing prospects. And she had perhaps 30 seconds to make the most important decision of her entire existence. She thought of her mother, thought of the medicines they could not afford, and the specialists who would not see them without payment, thought of the roof that leaked in 3 places, and the coal ration that left them shivering through winter nights, thought of Marcus Cleverley, abandoning her without a backward glance, and the years stretching ahead filled with similar humiliations and rejections, until she was too old even for fortune hunters to bother with. And then she thought of this man, this stranger who had witnessed her abandonment and been moved not to pity but to action, who offered not love but something perhaps more valuable, protection and security, and a kind of respect evident in his refusal to lie to her about what this marriage would be. She took a deep breath, felt it expand her lungs against his chest, and made her choice through silence, through the absence of protest, through the subtle relaxation of her body against his that signified acceptance if not enthusiasm, and she felt him register her surrender in the slight easing of tension in his arms and the almost imperceptible exhalation that suggested he had not been entirely certain she would acquiesce to this mad scheme. They rode on into the gathering darkness, the rain a silver curtain around them, heading north toward Scotland and a future she could not begin to imagine, and Penelope Ashworth, soon to be Hartley, Duchess of Ashford, closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, something dangerously close to hope. The blacksmith's shop in Gretna Green smelled of coal smoke and hot metal and something indefinably Scottish that Penelope could not name, and she stood there in borrowed clothes that were too large for her slender frame, the blacksmith's wife's second-best dress hanging off her shoulders, while her own ruined gown dried before the fire, watching the Duke of Ashford arrange their marriage with the same cold efficiency he might use to purchase a horse or negotiate a business contract. They had arrived near midnight after the longest, most surreal journey of Penelope's life. Hours spent pressed against the chest of a man she did not know, while his powerful arms encircled her and his stallion ate up the miles between London and Scotland with relentless determination, and she had moved through it all in a state of dreamlike detachment, as if watching herself from a great distance, unable to quite believe that this was happening, that she was truly fleeing to Gretna Green like some heroine from a sensational novel, that the Iron Duke himself had swept her onto his horse and declared his intention to marry her before she could even process what he was offering. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered Scotsman with kind eyes and hands scarred from years of working hot metal, looked between them with an expression of bemused concern that suggested he had performed many hasty marriages in his shop, but none quite so grim-faced as this one. And when he asked if they were certain about this course of action, if perhaps they might want to wait until morning, when heads were clearer and decisions could be made with proper reflection, Penelope heard herself speak with unexpected firmness that she was more sure of this than she had been of anything that afternoon. That yes, she was certain, even though she was not certain at all, but knew with bone-deep conviction that returning to London unwed after this mad flight would destroy what little remained of her reputation beyond any hope of recovery. The Duke provided all necessary information with clipped precision, his voice betraying no emotion as he gave his full name and title, confirmed his age and unmarried status, produced what seemed to be an impossible amount of money from his coat to pay the blacksmith's fee and ensure discretion. And through it all, Penelope watched him as if seeing a stranger, which of course he was. this powerful man who had decided her fate with the same unilateral authority he probably used to command his estates and manage his investments and direct his servants. The ceremony itself was brief and oddly intimate, despite the functional nature of the proceedings, conducted by candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls and made the whole scene feel even more unreal, like something happening in a fairy tale or a fever dream. And when the blacksmith asked in his thick Scottish burr if she, Penelope Margaret Ashworth, took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, she found herself looking up into the Duke's grey eyes for the first time since he had lifted her onto his horse in Hyde Park. What she saw there was not love, certainly not the romantic passion that young girls dreamed of finding in their husbands' eyes on their wedding day, but there was something else, something that looked oddly like desperation, a kind of grim determination mixed with what might have been fear or hope, or perhaps both, and she recognized it because she felt the same confusing tangle of emotions churning in her own chest, the terrifying knowledge that they were both leaping off a cliff together with no certainty of what waited below. "I do," she said, her voice steady despite everything, and heard him echo the words moments later in his deep voice that sent unexpected shivers down her spine. And then they were signing the register with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses, the scratch of the pen on paper somehow louder than the crackling fire, making it real, making it legal, making it irreversible. She was a duchess now, Penelope thought with dizzy disbelief, the Duchess of Ashford, one of the most powerful titles in England, and she had achieved it not through careful social maneuvering or advantageous family connections, but through the impulsive decision of a man she had never spoken to until this very day, a man who had seen her humiliation and responded by upending both their lives in the span of a few hours. The inn where they took rooms was simple and clean, the kind of respectable establishment that catered to travelers on the Great North Road, and Penelope was distantly aware of the innkeeper's wife fussing over her, bringing hot tea and expressing concern for her health after such a long journey in damp clothes. But she moved through these attentions like a woman under water, unable to fully engage with the reality of her situation until she found herself alone with the Duke in a small private parlour, a fire burning in the grate, and the rain that had finally stopped leaving the world outside, smelling fresh and new. He stood with his back to the fire, still in his travel-stained clothes, and she realized he looked as exhausted as she felt, his face drawn with fatigue and something else, something that might have been uncertainty or regret. And when he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been during the ceremony, less controlled. "I should explain why I did this," he said, and she watched as he seemed to struggle with where to begin. This man who had commanded her fate with such decisive authority now appearing almost vulnerable in the flickering firelight. And when the words finally came, they painted a picture of tragedy that made her own troubles seem almost small by comparison. His sister Catherine, he told her, had been everything good in the world, kind and gentle and trusting in the way that young girls raised in sheltered circumstances often were, believing the best of people even when they deserved the worst. And their father, the old Duke, had sold her in marriage at 18 to a man chosen for political alliance and financial advantage with no consideration for Catherine's happiness or safety. The Duke's husband, Alexander said with barely controlled fury vibrating in his voice, had not been kind. A masterful understatement that suggested horrors he could not or would not articulate. And 2 years ago, while Alexander was away serving with his regiment, word had reached him that Catherine had died from complications of a miscarriage, that she was already buried by the time he could desert his post and race home, that he had arrived 3 days too late even for her funeral and could only stand at her grave, knowing he had failed to protect her when she needed him most. "I swore that day," he said, staring into the fire as, if seeing that graveside scene play out in the flames, that if I ever had the power to prevent such suffering again, I would use it without hesitation. that I would not stand by and watch while someone was destroyed by society's cruelty and the selfishness of men who see women as nothing more than commodities to be traded for their own advantage. So I am your penance, Penelope heard herself say, the words emerging before she could stop them. You saved me to atone for not saving her, and she waited for him to confirm this, to admit that she was merely a substitute for his dead sister, a way for him to assuage his guilt through charitable intervention. But instead he turned to face her fully, and in the candlelight she could see the intensity in his grey eyes as he said something that shook her understanding of what had happened between them. You are my choice, he told her, perhaps the first one I have made freely since Catherine died. I chose you, Penelope, not because you were suitable or convenient, but because when I saw you standing in that rain, refusing to cry and maintaining your dignity while the world abandoned you, I saw someone worth saving, someone who deserved better than what society offered, someone who had the strength to survive what would have broken a lesser person. The words hung in the air between them, more intimate than any wedding vow, and Penelope found herself asking before she could consider the wisdom of it. And what do you deserve, your grace? Watching as surprise flickered across his features, as if no one had ever asked him such a question, as if his own needs and desires had become so subsumed beneath duty and guilt that he had forgotten he was entitled to want anything for himself. I have not considered that in some time, he admitted after a long pause, and there was something almost lost in his expression that made Penelope's heart ache for this powerful man who seemed as trapped by his circumstances as she had been by hers, both of them seeking escape through this mad marriage that might prove their salvation or their doom. The moment stretched between them, fragile and tentative, until finally he seemed to collect himself and became once more the decisive duke who had orchestrated their flight, informing her that he had taken the liberty of securing 2 rooms, that she would have privacy and time to rest, that her mother would be sent for immediately and installed in his London house with the finest medical care available, that she need not worry about propriety or expectations tonight or any night until she was ready. Before they parted for their separate rooms, he took her hand with surprising gentleness. This man who had handled everything else with such firm authority, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that should have felt perfunctory, but instead sent warmth spreading through her chilled body, and he whispered against her knuckles, I will never abandon you. Your Grace, whatever this marriage becomes, you have my word on that, and she believed him with an absoluteness that defied logic. Alone in her room, simple and clean with white linens and a window overlooking the darkened Scottish countryside, Penelope finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding at bay since Marcus Cleverley's carriage had disappeared into the rain, and she wept, great shuddering sobs that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with overwhelming relief that someone had intervened, that she was not alone anymore, even if she did not fully understand why this particular someone had chosen to care about her fate. In his own room down the hall, Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of rural Scotland filtering through his window, the distant bleating of sheep, and the crackle of settling timbers, and the whisper of wind through trees, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, or the first truly right choice he had made since standing at Catherine's grave and swearing his futile oath. He thought about Penelope's question, what did he deserve? And realized he had spent so long focused on duty and guilt and the weight of his title that he had forgotten to consider whether he might be entitled to something as simple as companionship, as profound as understanding, as unexpected as the possibility that this marriage of desperate convenience might become something neither of them had anticipated when they signed that register in the blacksmith's shop. Sleep evaded him as he replayed the moment when she had looked into his eyes during the ceremony, and he had seen not gratitude or fear, but a mirror of his own complicated emotions, the same desperate hope that perhaps they had both found in each other an escape from the prisons of their respective circumstances, and he wondered if she lay awake in her own room thinking similar thoughts, or if exhaustion had claimed her, granting her the peace that continued to elude him in the darkness of this wedding night that was unlike any wedding night in history. Two strangers legally bound but physically separated, connected only by mutual trauma and the fragile thread of possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, they had not made the worst decision of their lives when they agreed to face an uncertain future together, rather than certain destruction apart. 3 days after their midnight wedding in Scotland, Penelope returned to London as the Duchess of Ashford, and discovered that her absence had created a scandal of such magnificent proportions that even she, who had lived through her father's public disgrace and the subsequent social exile, was unprepared for the sheer viciousness of society's response to her sudden elevation. Marcus Cleverly, that paragon of cowardice who had abandoned her in the rain without a backward glance, had apparently spent the intervening days crafting a narrative that painted himself as the wronged party, and Penelope as a scheming adventuress who had orchestrated her own abandonment as part of an elaborate plot to entrap a wealthier, more powerful husband, and the Ton, always eager for scandal and ready to believe the worst of anyone who rose above their station, had seized upon this story with gleeful malice. The Duke's London mansion was a revelation of wealth and power that made Penelope's modest townhouse seem like a garden shed by comparison. All soaring ceilings and priceless artwork, and an army of servants who watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed skepticism. And she moved through these palatial rooms feeling like an imposter playing dress-up in borrowed finery, surrounded by things that could never truly be hers, no matter what the marriage register claimed. Her mother had been installed in a beautiful suite on the second floor with windows overlooking the gardens, attended by a nurse and visited daily by the finest physician in London. And when Penelope had gone to see her that first morning back, she had found Mamma looking better than she had in years, colour returning to her cheeks and the lines of pain around her eyes eased by proper medication and care. But there had been worry in her gaze as she took Penelope's hands and asked whether her daughter had sacrificed herself for her mother's sake. "He is kind, Mamma," Penelope had assured her, "kinder than anyone we have known in years," and realized as she said it that it was true, that despite the cold efficiency with which the Duke had orchestrated their marriage, there had been fundamental kindness in his intervention, in his promise to care for her mother, in his securing of separate rooms on their wedding night, in the way he had not demanded anything from her beyond her presence at his side. The ball that the Duke hosted to introduce his new Duchess was a calculated exercise in social warfare, an event that no one of consequence dared decline, because refusing the Duke of Ashford's invitation would be tantamount to social suicide. And Penelope had stood beside her husband in the receiving line, wearing a gown that cost more than her family had spent on clothing in the past 5 years, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing and judging, and finding her wanting. She had watched the faces of women who had once called her friend, seen them approach with false smiles and barely concealed claws, endured their pointed questions about how quickly the courtship must have progressed, listened to their observations about what a fortunate match it was for someone in her circumstances, and through it all she had maintained the composure that 5 years of navigating social catastrophe had taught her, smiling blandly, and offering nothing that could be twisted into further scandal. It was in the retiring room, a space that should have offered sanctuary, but instead became another battlefield, that she overheard Lady Wilmington holding court among a group of younger women, her voice carrying clearly over the rustle of silk and the clink of jewelry as she pronounced judgment on the new Duchess with all the authority of someone whose own engagement to Marcus Cleverly had apparently elevated her to the position of expert on proper behaviour. "Poor Duke Ashford," Lady Wilmington was saying with mock sympathy that fooled no one, trapped by a fortune hunter who probably stood in that rain deliberately knowing he rode in the park. What man could resist the appeal of a damsel in distress, even one so obviously calculating? And the other women had made noises of agreement, while Penelope stood frozen just outside the doorway, her hands clenching in the folds of her expensive gown. She could have retreated, should have, perhaps, could have pretended not to hear and avoided the confrontation that would only feed more gossip. But something hard and furious rose up in her chest, the same steel that had kept her standing during those endless minutes in Hyde Park while society abandoned her. And she walked into the room with her head high and her expression carved from ice. "You mistake me for someone who requires the good opinion of women who would marry men like Marcus Cleverly," she said into the sudden silence, her voice carrying the cut of a blade despite its measured tone. "I wish you joy of him, Lady Wilmington. You deserve each other. I do hope he does not abandon you in inclement weather, but given his character, I would advise investing in a sturdy umbrella." The shock on their faces was gratifying, but Penelope did not wait to savor it, simply turned and walked back into the ballroom with her heart pounding and her hands shaking from the rush of having finally struck back at the people who had spent years whispering about her family's fall while pretending sympathy. She did not see the Duke watching from across the crowded ballroom, did not know that he had witnessed the entire exchange, had followed her to the retiring room with some vague intention of checking on her welfare, and had instead heard her defend herself with a precision and composure that sent something dangerous and unfamiliar shifting in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably like pride mixed with admiration, and beneath it all, a warming affection that had no place in their practical arrangement. That night, after the guests had finally departed and the servants had cleared away the evidence of the ball, Penelope found herself summoned to the Duke's study, a masculine space of leather and dark wood and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that smelled of tobacco and old paper, and she entered with trepidation because she had no idea whether he approved or disapproved of her confrontation with Lady Wilmington and the others. He stood by the fireplace, still in his evening clothes but with his cravat loosened and his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it, and when he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Why did you not defend yourself?" he asked without preamble. "Why did you not tell them the truth of what happened, that Cleverly abandoned you, that you did not scheme or manipulate but were simply the victim of a cruel man's carelessness? Because, Your Grace," she said, moving further into the room and feeling the words rise up from some deep place of honesty she had not known she possessed, "you saved me. I will not repay that by making you an object of pity, the noble Duke who rescued a damsel in distress. Let them think me calculating if they must. I can bear their disdain. I have had years of practice at bearing far worse." The answer seemed to affect him in ways she could not quite pass, his expression shifting through several emotions too quickly for her to identify, before settling into something that might have been wonder or respect, or perhaps both. "You do not have to fight my battles," she added, because she had seen him confronting Marcus Cleverly earlier in the evening, had watched from across the room as the Duke had spoken to her former suitor with the kind of quiet menace that made grown men pale, and Marcus had departed shortly afterward, looking shaken and furious. "Yes, I do," the Duke said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You are my Duchess, but I am beginning to realize you are more than capable of fighting your own battles. Where did you learn such steel?" And Penelope found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. "5 years of holding my family together while creditors circled and society whispered." She told him, "You develop armor or you break. I chose armor," and saw understanding flicker in his gray eyes as he nodded slowly. "I chose armor too," he admitted, after Catherine died, after I realized that caring too much about anything or anyone only led to devastating loss. Perhaps we are both too armored now to let anyone close." And Penelope considered this as assessment before offering quietly, "Perhaps, or perhaps we understand each other because of it. Perhaps two people who have learned to protect themselves can learn to trust each other precisely because we know why the armor is necessary." The conversation continued late into the night, the first of what would become a habit of meeting in his study after the household had retired, and he poured her brandy despite the impropriety, and they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace like two generals negotiating a treaty, discussing everything from politics to philosophy to their respective experiences of grief and loss and survival. He showed her the portrait gallery on the second night of these meetings, walking her through his family history with commentary that was by turns acerbic and wistful, and when they stopped before a painting of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Penelope knew without being told that this was Catherine. "She was everything I should have protected," the Duke said, staring at his sister's painted face with an expression of such raw grief that Penelope felt her throat tighten in sympathy. She believed in the goodness of people even when they gave her every reason not to. She trusted that the world would be kind if she was kind first, and it destroyed her. That trust destroyed her. They stood in silence before the portrait, and Penelope found herself reaching out to take his hand, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. And he did not pull away, but instead gripped her fingers as if she were an anchor in turbulent seas. In the days that followed, small intimacies began to develop between them, the kind of unconscious familiarity that comes from proximity and shared experience. He began taking her arm naturally when they walked together, guiding her through rooms with a hand at the small of her back, and she found herself accepting his touch without the flinching awareness that had marked their early interactions. They developed a language of glances across crowded rooms, could communicate entire conversations with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a slight smile, and Penelope realized with a mixture of terror and wonder that the practical arrangement they had agreed to was becoming complicated by something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The crisis came during yet another social event, a musical at Lady Pemberton's house where attendance was mandatory for anyone claiming position in the ton, and Marcus cleverly had apparently decided that enough time had passed for him to approach the Duke with what he clearly considered a reasonable man-to-man conversation about the situation. Penelope watched from across the room as Marcus cornered her husband near the refreshment table, saw the Duke's posture shift into something predatory and dangerous, and though she could not hear the words exchanged, she saw Marcus's face go white and then red with fury before he stalked away. And when she asked the Duke later what had been said, he told her with grim satisfaction that he had made it clear that any further slander against his wife would result in cleverly being blackballed from every club in London and socially destroyed so thoroughly that even the Wilmington heiress's fortune would not save his reputation. "You did not have to do that," Penelope said, and saw his jaw tighten as he responded that, yes, actually he did, because she was his wife and his duchess, and he would not stand by while lesser men attempted to tear her down to salvage their own pride. The vehemence of his defense startled her, suggested depths of feeling that went beyond their practical arrangement, and that night in the study she found the courage to ask whether he regretted their hasty marriage, whether he wished he had left her in the rain to face her fate alone. "I find myself wanting to know you, Penelope," he said, instead of answering her question directly, "not as obligation, but as something I cannot quite name, something more than the practical partnership we agreed to," and she felt her heart stutter at the vulnerability in his admission. "I want that too," she whispered, "though it terrifies me, because wanting things had always led to disappointment in her experience, had always resulted in loss and pain and the bitter knowledge that hope was a luxury she could not afford. But perhaps," she thought as she looked at this complicated man who had upended her life with his impulsive rescue, perhaps with someone who understood the necessity of armor and the danger of vulnerability, perhaps with someone who had also learned that caring too much led to devastating loss. Perhaps it was finally safe to want something more than mere survival. Perhaps it was finally possible to imagine a future built not on desperate necessity, but on genuine connection, and the fragile hope that two damaged people might somehow make each other whole. 6 weeks into their marriage, Penelope woke one morning in her luxurious bedroom with its silk hangings and imported French furniture, and realized with dawning horror that she had fallen in love with her husband, not the careful affection of a convenient partnership or the grateful attachment of a rescued woman to her rescuer, but actual bone-deep, soul-shaking love that made her heart race when she heard his footsteps in the hallway and caused her breath to catch when he looked at her across the breakfast table with those serious grey eyes that had begun to soften when they rested on her face. The realization terrified her more than anything she had faced in all the years of her family's disgrace, more than standing alone in the rain while society whispered and pointed, more than the mad flight to Gretna Green, because loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you in ways that poverty and scandal and social exile never could, and she could not bear the thought of seeing pity or obligation in Alexander's eyes when he looked at his wife who had been foolish enough to mistake his kindness for something deeper. So she did what any sensible person who had survived years of hardship through careful self-protection would do. She withdrew, pulled back into the armor she had briefly allowed to crack, became once again the formal, polite stranger who had stood beside him in the blacksmith's shop and agreed to a practical arrangement with no messy emotions to complicate matters. She stopped meeting him in the study for their late-night conversations, claiming fatigue or headaches or correspondence that required her attention. She kept her responses at the breakfast table brief and impersonal, discussing household matters and social obligations with the efficient detachment of a housekeeper reporting to her employer, and she made certain never to be alone with him in situations that might lead to the kind of intimacy that had been developing between them. The casual touches and shared glances and moments of unguarded honesty that had made her foolish heart believe this could be more than what they had agreed. It would be. The Duke noticed her retreat immediately because he had been watching her, really watching her, for weeks now with an attention that went far beyond duty or concern, and he interpreted her coldness through the lens of his own deep-seated belief that he was fundamentally unworthy of love, that his sister's death had proven him incapable of protecting those he cared about, that Penelope's withdrawal was evidence she regretted their hasty marriage and wished she had been given the chance for a real courtship with a man who could offer her romantic devotion instead of a practical arrangement born from his guilt and her desperation. For 2 weeks they circled each other like wary strangers in the vast house that suddenly felt too small to contain their mutual misery, passing in hallways without speaking beyond the barest courtesies required by politeness, sitting at opposite ends of the dinner table engaged in stilted conversation about nothing of consequence, while servants moved between them like witnesses to a slow-motion disaster, and the entire household staff began whispering among themselves about what had happened to cause such a rift between the Duke and his new Duchess, who had seemed to be developing genuine affection before this inexplicable freeze descended. Finally, unable to bear the tension and convinced he was being cruel by keeping her trapped in a marriage she clearly regretted, the Duke requested a private audience in his study, and when Penelope entered that familiar room where they had spent so many hours in companionable conversation, she felt her heart crack at the sight of him standing by the window, looking haggard and drawn, as if he had not been sleeping well, which in fact he had not, because every night he lay awake wondering what he had done to drive her away and how he could fix it without admitting the terrifying truth that he had come to care for her far more than their practical arrangement should allow. "I have been selfish, Penelope," he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. He was trying and failing to control. "I dragged you into this marriage without consideration for what you might want. You were in distress and vulnerable, and I took advantage of that situation. You deserve better than a marriage of convenience to a man who cannot offer you what you deserve, who cannot give you the romance and courtship and love that any woman should expect from her husband." The words struck Penelope like physical blows because she heard in them confirmation of her worst fears, that he was telling her gently that he could not love her, that she should not expect or hope for anything beyond the practical arrangement they had agreed upon, and her pride rose up fierce and protective to prevent him from seeing how deeply his careful distance had wounded her. "I understand, Your Grace," she said, her voice admirably steady, despite the way her hands trembled in her lap. "You have fulfilled your obligation admirably. I require nothing more from this arrangement than what we agreed upon, security and status in exchange for my presence as your Duchess. I assure you I harbor no romantic illusions about our situation." He stared at her as if she had struck him, his grey eyes searching her face for something she refused to let him see. And when he spoke again, there was desperate hope underlying his words that she was too wrapped in her own hurt to recognize. "Nothing?" he asked. "You require nothing more? You are content with separate lives conducted under the same roof, with no expectation of companionship or intimacy, or the possibility that this marriage might become something beyond mere convenience?" And she heard it as him confirming the boundaries she had set, when what he was actually doing was begging her to cross them, to tell him she wanted more, to give him permission to court his own wife, and attempt to win the heart he had already lost his own to. "Nothing," she confirmed, her voice cold as ice to prevent it from breaking. "Thank you for your honesty." "Your Grace, I appreciate your frankness about the limitations of our arrangement." And she stood before he could say anything else, before her composure could shatter, and left the study with her head high and her heart in pieces. The 2 weeks that followed were a special kind of torture for them both. The Duke buried himself in parliamentary business and estate management, spending long hours away from the house or closeted in his study with ledgers and correspondence that could not fill the aching void her absence created, while Penelope threw herself into charity work with the fierce dedication of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts, visiting hospitals and orphanages and organizing relief efforts for the poor with an energy that impressed everyone who worked with her and fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the shadows under her eyes and the brittleness of her smiles. Penelope's mother, now fully recovered and sharp-eyed with returned health, watched her daughter's misery with growing frustration until finally she could bear it no longer, and confronted Penelope in her sitting room one afternoon. "You love him, child?" she said without preamble. "I see it in every look you give him when you think no one is watching, in the way you flinch when he enters a room as if his mere presence causes you pain. Why will you not tell him how you feel? Why do you torture yourself and him with this false distance?" "Because he does not love me, Mama," Penelope replied, her composure finally cracking to reveal the raw hurt beneath. "He saved me from ruin, and I am grateful, but that is not the same as love. He married me from guilt over his sister's death. I am his penance and his second chance to save someone, and I cannot bear to see pity in his eyes when he realizes I have been foolish enough to want more than he can give." Her mother tried to argue, but Penelope refused to hear it, convinced of the truth of her own interpretation, blind to any evidence that might contradict her certainty that Alexander saw her only as an obligation nobly fulfilled. Then Marcus cleverly, now married to Lady Wilmington, and discovering that a fortune did not compensate for a lifetime spent with a shallow, demanding woman who reminded him daily that she had settled for him when better prospects failed to materialize, decided in a fit of spite to spread a rumor so cruel and so perfectly calibrated to wound that it spread through London society like wildfire. The Duke of Ashford, Marcus told anyone who would listen at his club, had married Penelope Ashworth as the result of a wager made during his Cambridge days, a challenge among friends to rescue the most pathetic spinster in London and elevate her to Duchess as the ultimate proof of aristocratic power and whimsy. The whole dramatic scene in Hyde Park had been orchestrated by the Duke himself, including the convenient rainstorm and the galloping rescue. Poor Miss Ashworth had been nothing but a pawn in a cruel game played by bored noblemen. The lie was vicious, and just plausible enough given the Duke's reputation for cold calculation and the seemingly improbable speed of their courtship and marriage, that it gained traction among those eager to believe the worst. And when Penelope heard it third-hand from her dressmaker who thought the Duchess should know what was being said, she felt the last fragile hope she had been nursing, despite everything, finally die in her chest. She did not confront the Duke because what would be the point? If the rumor was true, then confronting him would only force him to either admit the terrible truth or lie to spare her feelings. And if it was false, then asking him to deny it would reveal how much she cared about his opinion, how desperately she needed to believe he had married her for reasons beyond guilt or wages or penance. And she could not bear to expose herself that completely to someone who had made it clear he wanted nothing from her beyond the practical arrangement they had agreed upon. Instead, with the same decisive action that had characterized her years of survival, she made arrangements to leave, quietly packing her belongings with the help of her lady's maid, who wept and tried to dissuade her, preparing to retreat to her late father's country estate in Derbyshire, which was technically part of her dowry and therefore under the Duke's control, but which she thought she might claim as a dower property, where she could live separately and leave him free to find happiness with someone he chose from desire rather than obligation. She wrote him a note because disappearing without explanation seemed cowardly, and because she owed him at least a farewell after everything he had done for her. And she poured into it all the gratitude she felt, and none of the love, because that would be unfair, to burden him with emotions he had never asked for and could not return. "Thank you for your kindness," she wrote in her careful script. "I release you from this arrangement. You have done enough penance for your sister. You deserve happiness, not obligation. You saved me from ruin and gave my mother care and restored our name, and I am grateful beyond words. But I cannot remain knowing I am your penance and your sister's ghost. You deserve a wife you chose freely, not from guilt or wages or whatever motivated your rescue of me. I free you from this bond, even if the law cannot. Live well, Alexander. You are a far better man than you believe. Yours in gratitude, if not in presence. Penelope." She left the note on his desk in the study where she knew he would find it, and in the grey light of dawn before the household stirred, she climbed into the carriage she had ordered prepared, her trunks loaded and her mother installed beside her because she would not leave Mamma behind, even if it meant explaining why they were fleeing. And as the horses began to move, she allowed herself one last look at the grand house that had briefly felt like home, at the windows of the study where Alexander would eventually discover her absence and read her farewell. And she told herself firmly that this was the right choice, the only choice, that staying would only lead to greater heartbreak when he eventually tired of the obligation she represented and sought connection elsewhere. The Duke found the note 2 hours later when he emerged from a sleepless night and entered his study to find it propped against the miniature portrait of Penelope he had commissioned without her knowledge, a perfect tiny rendering of her face that he had been staring at for weeks like a lovesick fool, trying to understand when obligation had transformed into something far more dangerous and necessary. His hands shook as he read her words, his breath coming faster as he absorbed what she was telling him, that she thought herself his penance, that she believed the vicious rumor about the wager, that she was releasing him from their marriage as if it were a burden he had been longing to shed, when in truth it had become the most important thing in his life, without him quite realizing when or how it had happened. He read it through twice, and then crumpled the paper in his fist and roared, an inarticulate sound of anguish and fury that brought his valet running, convinced his master must be injured or under attack. And when the servant burst through the door, he found the Duke standing in the middle of his study with devastation written across his features and a crumpled note clutched in his hand. "She is gone," Alexander said, his voice raw with emotion he had spent years learning to suppress. "She thinks I married her from guilt. She believes that damned lie about a wager. She has convinced herself she is my obligation and my penance. When the truth is she has become everything, and I have been too much a coward to tell her so, too afraid of vulnerability to admit I need her far more than she has ever needed me." The valet, who had served the Duke since before Catherine's death, and had never seen his stoic master display such raw feeling, asked quietly where the Duchess had gone, and when Alexander told him Derbyshire, The man's lined face creased in something that might have been a smile. "Then go after her." "Your Grace," he said simply, "go and tell her what you should have told her weeks ago, that this marriage stopped being about penance the moment you realized she was not a damsel to be saved, but a woman to be loved." And the Duke looked at this servant who had witnessed every moment of his grief over Catherine and his subsequent emotional shutdown, and saw understanding and encouragement in the old man's eyes. He was right, of course, Alexander thought, as he stood there clutching Penelope's farewell note and feeling something crack open in his chest, the careful armor he had maintained for years splitting apart to reveal the vulnerable truth underneath. He had been a coward, had hidden behind their practical arrangement and his own unworthiness rather than risk the terrifying vulnerability of admitting he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with his wife, had been too afraid of loss to fight for what he wanted most. But Penelope had fought for her dignity in Hyde Park and her reputation at the ball and her family's survival for 5 brutal years, and he would be damned if he let her believe for one more moment that she was anything less than absolutely essential to his happiness and his future and his very ability to breathe. He would go after her, he decided, with the same decisive clarity that had sent him galloping through the rain to rescue her 6 weeks ago. He would ride to Derbyshire and tell her every truth he had been too afraid to speak. And if she rejected him, then at least she would do so, knowing the full extent of his feelings, rather than laboring under the false belief that she had ever been anything less than wanted and cherished and absolutely necessary to a man who had given up on his own happiness until she stood alone in the rain and reminded him what courage looked like. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Duke found Penelope's note at dawn, the sun barely cresting the horizon and painting his study in shades of grey and gold that seemed to mock the darkness descending over his heart as he read her careful words releasing him from their marriage, and for exactly 3 minutes he sat in stunned paralysis, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him, that she was gone, that she thought herself his penance, that she believed the vicious lie about a wager when the truth was so much more complicated and terrifying than any rumor could capture. Then the paralysis shattered, and he moved with the military precision that had once made him an excellent commander, shouting for his valet to prepare riding clothes immediately, bellowing for the stables to saddle his fastest horse, sending a footman running to determine how long ago the Duchess had departed and which road she had taken, and within 15 minutes of finding that devastating note, he was mounted on his black stallion and galloping out of London toward Derbyshire with a single-minded focus that allowed no room for doubt or hesitation, or the fear that he might already be too late. The journey to her father's country estate normally required 4 hours at a reasonable pace with stops to rest the horses, but Alexander pushed his mount mercilessly, changing horses twice at posting inns and making the trip in 2.5 hours of hard riding that left him disheveled and mud-splattered, and beyond caring what he looked like, because the only thing that mattered was reaching Penelope before she convinced herself more thoroughly that she was unwanted, before the distance between them became too great to bridge with mere words and desperate declarations. He found her in the overgrown garden behind the manor house, a once beautiful space that had fallen into picturesque decay during the years of her family's financial troubles, roses running wild over crumbling stone walls and ivy creeping across pathways that grass had begun to reclaim, and she sat on a weathered stone bench, wearing not the expensive silks and satins he had provided, but an old simple dress of faded blue muslin that must have dated from before her father's disgrace, and she looked more herself than she ever had in all the Duchess finery, more real and present and absolutely essential to his continued existence. It was raining again, a warm summer shower that turned the garden into something from a painting, drops sliding off rose petals and creating ripples in the old fountain basin. And when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats coming up the drive, she turned with an expression of confusion that transformed into shock as she recognized him, standing slowly from her bench as he came into view, and he saw in her face an echo of that moment in Hyde Park, the same frozen disbelief, the same question in her eyes about whether this was rescue or something else entirely. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a splash that sent water spraying across his already soaked riding breeches, and he strode toward her with purpose and determination and terror churning in his chest, because this was the moment. This was when he would finally be honest about everything he felt, and if she rejected him, then at least she would do so, knowing the complete truth rather than the partial story they had been telling themselves for weeks. "I am in love with you," he said without preamble, without apology, his voice rough from the hard ride and the emotion he was no longer trying to contain. "I have been in love with you since you refused to cry in that storm, since you looked society's cruelty in the face and did not flinch, since you understood my grief without me having to explain it, since you stood up to Lady Wilmington with such perfect icy composure that I wanted to applaud. I did not marry you from guilt or penance or because of any damned wager. I married you because in that moment in Hyde Park I saw you and I thought, there she is, the only woman in England who could possibly understand me, who has survived enough to know what strength really means, who will not bore me or coddle me or treat me like a prize to be won." Penelope stared at him, rain streaming down her face mixing with what might have been tears, her hands clutched together at her waist and her expression cycling through disbelief and hope and fear so quickly he could barely track the emotions. And he kept talking because if he stopped, he might lose his courage, might retreat back into the safe distance they had been maintaining instead of pushing forward into this terrifying vulnerability. "I was afraid you would refuse me," he continued, stepping closer until only a few feet separated them. "So I gave you no choice. I made the decision for both of us and swept you away before you could protest. And that was wrong. It was arrogant and high-handed and a violation of your autonomy even if I told myself I was saving you. So I am giving you a choice now. I am offering you what I should have offered from the beginning, the freedom to decide your own fate." Then he did something he had not done since he was a boy pleading with his father to reconsider Catherine's marriage. He dropped to one knee in the mud and the rain, heedless of his expensive riding clothes or his dignity, or the fact that he was a duke kneeling before a woman who technically already bore his name. And he looked up at her with his heart in his eyes and asked the question that would determine the rest of his life. "Penelope Ashworth Hartley, Duchess of Ashford, will you marry me again, properly this time? Will you marry me for love? Will you choose this marriage not because I left you no alternative, but because you want what I want, a partnership built on genuine affection and respect, and the terrifying, wonderful possibility that two damaged people might make each other whole?" The silence that followed felt eternal, rain pattering on leaves and stone and their soaked clothing, while Penelope looked down at him with an expression he could not read, and Alexander felt his heart hammering against his ribs with the knowledge that she might say no, might tell him it was too late, that he had hurt her too badly with his distance and his assumptions and his failure to speak plainly about his feelings before everything went so terribly wrong. "What if we hurt each other?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "What if this does not work? What if love is not enough to overcome all the ways we have learned to protect ourselves? What if I disappoint you, or you grow tired of me, or we discover that the connection we thought we had was just desperation and proximity and the drama of our beginning?" "Then we will hurt together," he answered immediately, rising from his knee but staying close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes and count the freckles the sun had brought out across her nose. "I would rather risk pain with you than live safely without you. I spent 2 years after Catherine died, convinced that the answer was to feel nothing, to armor myself so completely that loss could never touch me again, and it was a kind of death. Penelope, it was existing without living. And then saw you in that park, and something woke up inside me. Something I thought had died with my sister. The desire to fight for something, to care about someone, to believe that connection was worth the risk of loss. She reached out then, her hand trembling as it touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with fingertips that sent shivers through his entire body despite the warmth of the rain. And when she spoke, her voice was thick with tears and wonder, and the fragile beginning of belief. "I love you too," she said. "I have been so frightened of it, so convinced that loving you would destroy me because you could never love me back, that I was nothing but your penance and your second chance to save someone. And I could not bear the thought of seeing pity in your eyes when you looked at me. Could not survive being another obligation in a life already weighted with duty and guilt." He caught her hand against his face, pressed his lips to her palm in a kiss that was reverent and desperate. And when he pulled back, he made sure she was looking directly into his eyes so she could see the absolute truth of what he was about to say. "I did not save you in Hyde Park, Penelope," he told her. "You saved me. I had been dead inside since Catherine died, going through motions and fulfilling obligations, but not truly living, not allowing myself to feel or want or hope for anything beyond getting through each day without dishonoring my family name. And then I saw you, alive and furious and unbowed despite everything society had done to break you, and something in me woke up. I did not want to watch anymore. I wanted to live with you. I wanted to know what it felt like to care about someone again, even if it meant risking the devastating loss I had sworn never to experience again. You are not my penance," he continued, cupping her face in both hands now, his thumbs brushing away tears that mixed with rain. "You are my redemption, my second chance not to save my sister, because I cannot do that. And I have finally accepted that Catherine's fate was not mine to control, but to choose love instead of duty, to choose life instead of grief, to choose you every day for the rest of my life, not because I must, but because I cannot imagine wanting to choose anyone else." "I am afraid of being left again," Penelope whispered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists as if anchoring herself to him. "I am afraid of standing alone in the rain and watching you ride away. I am afraid that this feeling will not last, that you will wake up one day and realize you made a mistake in that moment of impulse, and I will be left with a love you do not want and cannot return." "I am afraid of losing someone I love again," he replied honestly. "I am afraid that caring this much gives fate another target, another way to hurt me. I am terrified that I will fail to protect you the way I failed to protect Catherine. We are both afraid, Penelope, both scarred by our pasts and uncertain about our future. But love is terrifying. It is vulnerability and risk, and the possibility of devastating loss. It is also the only thing worth the fear, the only thing that makes being alive mean something more than just existing." "Ask me again," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now, more certain, and he saw in her eyes the same decisive clarity that had allowed her to survive 5 years of hardship. "And face down Lady Wilmington and write him that heartbreaking note releasing him from obligation. Ask me properly." He smiled then, the first genuine smile he had felt in weeks, and dropped to his knee again in the muddy garden path, taking her hand in his and looking up at her with love and hope and desperate longing written plainly across his features. "Will you be my wife?" he asked, not for convenience or society or any practical reason, not because I rescued you or you needed protection or either of us was desperate, but because we choose each other, because I love you and I believe you love me, and that is reason enough to build a life together." "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet with surprising strength. "Yes, I choose you. I choose us. I choose love, even though it terrifies me. I choose the risk and the vulnerability and the possibility that we might hurt each other, because the alternative is living without you, and I have discovered I cannot do that. I tried for 2 weeks, and it was agony. You have become essential to me, Alexander. You have become home. He kissed her then, finally, desperately, all the emotion of the past weeks pouring into the press of his lips against hers, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck as his encircled her waist, pulling her so close there was no space between them, and they stood in the rain, kissing like they were the only 2 people in the world, like nothing existed beyond this garden and this moment, and the love they had finally found the courage to claim. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and grinning like fools, Penelope laughed and said, "You do realize we are already married." And he laughed too, the sound rusty from disuse, but genuine and joyful in a way he had not experienced since before Catherine's death. "Then marry me every day," he replied, "in every way that matters. Marry me in the morning when we wake up together, and in the evening when we sit by the fire. Marry me in public when we face society's judgment, and in private when it is just us. Marry me in words and actions and choices. Keep choosing me. Penelope and I will keep choosing you until we are old and grey and have forgotten what it felt like to be alone." They stayed in the garden for hours, talking through everything that had gone wrong between them, clearing away the misunderstandings and false assumptions that had driven them apart. And the rain continued to fall around them, but neither suggested going inside because this felt right somehow. Standing together in the storm instead of running from it, facing the elements together instead of separately, and by the time they finally made their way into the house, they were soaked through and shivering, but happy in a way that felt hard-won, and therefore precious. The journey back to London happened slowly this time, with stops at comfortable inns where they truly began their marriage away from the pressures of society and expectation, learning each other's bodies and hearts with the patience and attention they had not allowed themselves before. And by the time they returned to the Duke's townhouse, they moved together with the unconscious synchronization of a couple who had been married for years rather than weeks, finishing each other's sentences and communicating with glances across crowded rooms and touching casually, constantly, as if reassuring themselves the other was real and present and staying. 6 months later they attended a ball at Lady Pemberton's house, the same woman who had once whispered about poor Miss Ashworth's fall from grace, and all of society watched as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford danced together with expressions of such obvious devotion that even the most cynical gossips had to admit they had never seen a couple more clearly in love. He gazed at her like she was the only woman in the room, and she smiled at him with such warmth that it seemed to light her from within, transforming her from merely pretty to absolutely radiant. As they turned through the waltz, he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "I would gallop through 1,000 storms for you." And she replied without hesitation, "And I would wait in every one knowing you would come back." And they both smiled at the truth of it, at the knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, not a rescue or an obligation or a convenient arrangement, but a genuine partnership built on love and choice, and the courage to be vulnerable with someone who understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Dear listener, the story concluded in the familiar, warm voice that had guided countless people to sleep. Perhaps you have felt left behind in your own storm, standing alone, while the world moved on without you, watching others find shelter while you remained exposed to the elements. But remember that the right person will not leave you in the rain. They will gallop back again and again until you believe you are worth coming back for. Love is not convenient, and it is not safe. It is a choice made every day to be brave together, to face the storms as partners rather than as individuals struggling alone. Tonight, rest knowing that your storm will pass, and when it does, you will be stronger for having weathered it. Sleep well and dream of second chances. Dream of someone seeing you, truly seeing you for exactly who you are and choosing to stay. Remember that it is never too late for love to find you in unexpected places, for rescue to come from surprising sources, for your life to transform in the span of a single rainstorm. With all our love, this is Legends of the Fall, reminding you that every ending is also a beginning, and every storm eventually clears to reveal the sun. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford lived happily, not in the sense of never facing difficulties, but in the sense of facing them together. They argued and made up. They challenged each other and supported each other. They built a life that was messy and real and infinitely more satisfying than the safe, distant arrangement they had initially agreed to. And on rainy days, they would sometimes walk through Hyde Park hand in hand, stopping at the spot where it all began, where he had first seen her standing alone and unbowed, where she had first glimpsed the possibility of a different future. And they would stand together in the rain, two people who had learned that love was worth the risk, that vulnerability was strength, that choosing each other every day was the greatest adventure of all, and as the rain fell around them, they would smile and remember and be grateful for that first storm that had brought them together, and every storm since that had taught them what it meant to truly come home.